Good afternoon. This is Thomas Arnold. I'm the Director of Client Services at Enterprise Recovery Systems. And I'm welcoming all of you to our webinar today called Compliance Checkup, What Your Institution Needs to Know. This is our fourth webinar this fiscal year, and we are very excited to be presenting this for you today. Just a little background on myself before we get going. I've been with ERS for the past 2 years. And prior to that, I spent 8 years in admissions and financial aid with Kaplan University in their online and campus-based programs. As I said before, we're really excited to have you all here, and as we go through the presentation today, if you have any troubleshooting issues or concerns, you can reach out to GoToMeeting tech support through the help option at the top of your page, and there is also a question and answer text box that is available as well, and you can reach out to us through there throughout the presentation. You can also email webinars@ersinc.com. for that. Today, the presentation, and finally, the presentation will be made available on our website probably by Monday. It will be loaded onto our website, and we'll provide that link for you as well at the end of the presentation. I would like to introduce our host and facilitator, Judy Flink, to you all today. She is a higher education veteran who has done it all, having 30-plus years in student financial services experience at one of the largest campus systems in the United States. She's the former president of Cohio and has served and/or has been a speaker with countless other industry organizations. No one in this industry is more qualified to host this presentation for you today.
Thank you, Tom. I'm delighted today to be here and to be able to introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is a dear friend of mine. Ron and I have known each other for a number of years, and he agreed to come today and talk to us about a very important issue, compliance. It's a very important issue, but I know it's also the bane of all our existence, and we get very frustrated with having to deal with it. But it's a reality that we have to deal with on a daily basis. But Ron is the president of Campus Guard, and he's responsible for the strategic vision and growth of the business. He understands higher ed inside and out due to all of his years, as I stated, in the market space. He has spoken at a number of meetings, including NACUBO, the National Association of College and University Business Officers. So thank you, Ron, for joining us today. Our other speaker is Merle Iskett. Merle is a member of the ERS team, and she has significant experience in the college and university vertical. And many of you have heard Merle speak over the years on a number of topics relating to higher education and collections and compliance and things that affect us on a daily basis. Throughout the presentation, we will put up some polls and ask you to please provide us with your information at that point so we can gauge everybody's experience in what they're doing with compliance. And as Tom mentioned, at the end of the webinar, we will be posting a survey. And it's really important that you give us the information on the survey as we're working here at the ERS company to think of what our next topics will be. So if you fill those out for us, that would be greatly appreciated. I'm now going to turn it over to Merle.
Thank you, Judy. I appreciate it. Let's look a minute at our agenda and what we're going to talk about today. This is our compliance update for 2016. I want to also join in with Judy and welcome Ron as he takes it after we go through the agenda and a couple of other things and actually does the meat of this presentation for us. So this is an update. This is what's going on right now. We're going to talk about what needs protection and what doesn't need protection, about the security that's involved, and what is the compliance issues for higher education. You know, we're a little different from all of the other industries, so we have things that are required in the higher education area. And talk about goals and requirements, and then what to do, and what the training and resources are that you can use going forward. If you look at the next slide, this is our update. We're going to talk about red flags, the PCI, HIPAA. Many of you may or may not know that HIPAA has a big impact on us in the higher ed. FERPA and the Graham-Leach Act. So, Ron, would you like to take it from here?
Okay, well, thank you, Merle. So glad to be with everyone today. And here we are in the first week of spring cleaning. So let's think about clearing our desks and clearing our thoughts about what we need to do in higher education regarding compliance. As we said earlier, it's something that is out there on our desk in our offices, and we can't. It's going to be always be there. I was at the NACUBO SFS conference last year, and sitting in, and we were talking that day about just all the regulations about financial aid, and it just dawned on me, how in the world can everyone get their job done when we have to worry about all of these things? There are 5 of them up here, you know, HIPAA, PCI, Graham-Leach, Bliley, FERPA, red flags, but there are many, many more. And so how do we organize in the office, and then how do we prioritize and that kind of thing? It's a huge area to be concerned about, but we have to be concerned because we have to be compliant. And those are students and parents and the community that we serve is depending upon us to protect personally identifiable information. So we're going to talk about those different things today.
So here comes our first poll question for everybody. Do you currently require your staff to go through annual compliance training? And if you'll check all that apply, FERPA, Graham-Leach, red flag, PCI. We'll give you a little time to answer that.
Okay. As we're answering those questions here, I've chosen these 5 that we're talking about. FERPA is for protecting privacy of student records. Graham-Leach Bliley deals with protecting and being accountable for financial information. So your CFOs have to be accountable for this. Red flags then affects everyone. If you're defined as a creditor or providing a service to be paid for at another time, you are under red flags. HIPAA, of course, is the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act. And the PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are 2 major differences between PCI and the rest of those. Give you 10 seconds here to ponder what you might think the differences are. That's enough time. Okay, here are the differences. For one, FERPA, Graham-Leach, Bliley, red flags, and HIPAA are all federal regulations. So they're under federal acts and federal laws. And that's one major thing. PCI DSS is by contract law. So it's not federal law, not state law, it's contract law. If you are a merchant, meaning you're defining as a merchant if you're taking accept credit card for payments for any product or service at the university, then you fall under PCI DSS. So that's the difference there between those is contract law versus federal regulations. The second major one that I think of is the fact that all the rest of those, you have to go through all kinds of hoops, get board approvals and everything for your policies, have training programs in place, et cetera, et cetera. And then unless and until there is a major breach or whatever, no one comes and audits those, particularly from under the PCI DSS.
Ron, if your institution uses a third-party processor, what should schools be asking them about?
Good question. Because we're talking now about service providers. By definition, a service provider. There's a business in the HIPAA world. That's a business associate or whatever, but a service provider. So the requirement then is that if you are using a third-party processor or a third-party company, we'll say one that's collecting admissions information for you, then you must be assured that and get proof that they are certified with under PCI compliance. They are certified as a service provider. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, and that's requirement number 12 in the PCI DSS. Okay, do we have results here?
We do. So 74% are doing some form of training with FERPA, and then we drop down to PCI at 46, red flags at 30, and Graham Leach at 22. So I think, Ron, a question I would ask you looking at the numbers, while people seem to be more compliant with FERPA from a compliance standpoint, would you encourage them to also, if they're doing FERPA training, to add the other trainings in?
Well, they certainly should, because in most all of those, there's a requirement then for training upon initial hire, and then also annual training, and then keeping records for that. But the best defense is that for everyone to be trained. Year in and year out, one of the, and looking at breaches and problems and whatever, is from lack of training.
Mm-hmm.
It's from very simple things, very simple and basic things where people are failing. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So we're going to go on then. Okay. Help me with this, please. Okay. All right. So let's talk about what we're looking at anyway for what needs to be protection and the protection. So I'm going to be talking from the point of view, this is a definition of what is personally identifiable information, PII. And so it's been defined then as that any information that can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity. So that could be a social security number, their name, their date and place of birth, their mother's maiden name, or other records. So that is what PII is, okay? Or any other information that can be linked to an individual, be it medical record, educational, financial, and employment information. All of that is considered personally identifiable information. And so that is what we must protect. And that is across the board in FERPA, HIPAA, PCI, red flags, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we're protecting PII, protect personally identifiable information. Okay. So for FERPA, of course, that's education records. And everyone in the audience, I think, will know what we're talking about there, regardless of the office that you're in, because it is across the entire campus, every department. HIPAA is the health information, financial information for Graham Leach Bliley, and then access for red flags, and then payment card information is the PCI DSS. And if you are in the bursar or the cashier's office, you have every one of these to worry about, every single one of these to worry about. But you're not the only one. You also, your IT department has concerns and issues with this, as well as other departments. Okay. So all of this, I said it was PII. Another definition, another acronym for this is CSI, confidential and sensitive information. So depending on the locale where you are, is the terms are going to be used is PII or CSI. Okay, so in the beginning, I showed the gears all separate or whatever, and so the point that I wanted to make on this is that what you need to be doing at your campus is have an overall integrated PII program, campus program and everything, because everyone in your office are involved to some degree in this, and so you may have different requirements at different times for PCI compliance, et cetera, than HIPAA, et cetera, but they all are integrated. And also, if you are doing the right things in protecting, say, payment card information, if you are putting the right controls there, particularly in the IT side, then you are going to be by a long way toward successfully doing the same thing with your other considerations there.
Ron, I know a lot of times I've been engaged in conversations where people are very confused about when does that student information become under the compliance umbrella of FERPA. Is it the day they apply? Is it the day they enroll, the day they're accepted?
Merle, why don't you, that'd be a good one for you to answer. So when does it apply? When must protection be extended for student record? Judy, you asked the question. Why don't you answer the question? I'm not going to be able to answer that.
Oh,
right
okay. I've been off campus for a while, but it was always my understanding that once they are admitted, then their information becomes protected by FERPA.
Yeah. And we'll talk about a further definition of what it, what the definition is of when you have it, who owns it, and that kind of thing. All right. But the point I wanted to make on this slide is it absolutely is incumbent upon all campuses to be successful and to have an overall program protecting this personally identifiable information. Okay. All right. So next slide here then is when there's always a question here as when must you be compliant? What are the dates or whatever? Or if you're working toward compliance, the other part of this is how long will it take? Here's one way to think about it. If those of you that are in Michigan today, in the great city here that we're referring to, is that it's looked at as so difficult sometimes and painful that you might think that you're never going to be compliant. You're never going to be compliant. But when you step back and look at it, all of it can be very common sense, and put programs in place and working together with particularly with IT on staff, that you can be compliant. So I didn't want to be so negative here on this, though I love this slide because it does kind of put a little humor in this, that it may be a long time before you be compliant, as to how some people take that. Okay, all right. So as you're going through the process of becoming compliant here, it really does parallel what is known as the 5 stages of grief. The first one is denial, not thinking that it really applies to your office. It's mandatory. We all know that. Red flags, FERPA, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, and PCI compliance are all mandatory. If we're in this business of higher education and we're in the business of taking credit cards for payment, then we all have to follow these regulations. So go through denial, get through that. The next one is anger, saying it's not fair. The rules apply to everyone. Bargaining, you'll do some of it. For PCI, it's pass-fail. You're either 100% compliant or you fail. And then also, if you are by definition a creditor, then you must implement red flag rules, as an example. So these are things that, if you are liable for compliance, then you're liable for all of it as it comes about. Okay. Then the other depression, this one kind of links back to the previous slide there, never getting there. You'll never get there. You worry about that. Most of your peers have gone through this. All of them are going through this. Everyone's working toward it, and you will get there. And then eventually, you'll become compliant, or working toward compliance every day, because after all, what we're going to show is that all of these requirements really are best practices, common sense, things we should be doing. Okay. Okay. So we've talked about why care a little bit, but here's some more points on this. Is that one, if you wind up having a fail point, if you will, then lost productivity. Your job is going to change for the next 6 or 18 months, and that you're going to be responding to an agency in this. You have state laws, by the way. You have state laws requiring notification and often more. So let's take a minute here and just talk about some of the results of non-compliance or a breach, if you will, on some of these other factors. I'll take PCI as an example. If you have a major breach, and it's egregious enough where Visa and MasterCard alert the bank, who will then alert your office, then depending upon your status at that particular time, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover each could fine your institution $500,000, starting right away. Then you have the costs involved in notifying all the potential victims, replacing the stolen cards, replacing the value of the lost monies, et cetera, et cetera. And then also Visa could send a very expensive forensics team to your campus for several weeks at your cost, and it's going to change everything for quite a while. So I think 46% in the poll said that they were PCI compliant. Everyone needs to be working toward compliance. Okay, and then also the other thing I've had of here is that parents and students and the community really are expecting that we're going to be protecting the personally identifiable information. Okay. I have a point up there that says state laws requiring notification. One more point here. I'm sorry. Besides all of these things, your reputation is priceless, absolutely priceless in this, because it will not be. The reporter who reports this on Monday morning will not know the details and what could have happened and whatever. All they will know is that put the name of your college or university will be the one in print, and then you'll have a lot of questions to answer. Okay, all right.
Okay, time again for another poll. This time we want to know, is your department compliant with the PCI DSS? Yes or no, NA, or don't know?
Be interesting to see the results on this. While we're doing this, I'll say the Treasury Institute for Higher Education has an annual PCI workshop. It'll be in May. There'll be another plug on this at the end of this. But every year we ask attendants, then those that are coming prior, we ask that question as one of the questions. Mm-hmm. So I know what those stats have been for the last 5 years. We'll see how that compares today. Okay, we have what, 60% say yes presently? Is that right? Am I reading that correctly? 50%. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. For the last 3 years, this question has been asked of universities prior to the conference, and the number year in and year out is 50%. 50%. After 3 days of talking about PCI compliance, I asked the question again of those that are still in attendance. Usually everyone's there. If there were 200 universities there, approximately 4 will say they're compliant after understanding what it really takes to be compliant. Okay. All right. That's a great question. Okay, let's go. Okay. So I mentioned that I talked about the fines that could come from Visa, we'll say. Just on payment cards and everything, but in every one of these instances, also for all of these protecting PII, with the exception of 4 states, there are state breach notification laws. And since we're sitting in Illinois today, we'll talk about the Illinois. So Illinois has the Personal Identifiable Protection Act, PIPA, P-I-P-A. And it created specific requirements for universities to notify individuals when personally identifiable information may have been exposed. And so there's certain things you have. So you have the requirement then within as quickly as possible. I forgot exact words, but that's what it says. Without delay, to notify the state agency, and then also notify the Federal Trade Commission, and then notify the potential victims. And the data that could have been triggered this notification would be, say, a social security number, a driver's license number, a financial account number, or a credit card or debit card in combination with the security code or the password. If any of that had been exposed, then PIPA takes effect. And then there's fines that are associated with that also. You know, $100 per in Illinois, $100 per individual account, plus $50,000 if it was found that that the university had not properly been disposing of that kind of information, protecting it. Plus, then there could be attorney general action, and then also you have 5 days. Here's another one: 5 days to report what happened to the General Assembly. Now, every state is similar, but that is particularly the ones in Illinois. Okay. So I want to talk a moment here. We've been talking about compliance, but has always been a discussion, argument would be another term, about the difference between compliance and security. Does compliance mean that you are secure? It is the issue here. And the analogy that I want to use, I want to go to this next slide, is a driver's license, if you will. So here, this is a general wording of most states' Department of Motor Vehicles requirements for getting a driver's license. This is particularly as a motorcycle license here. So this one, say every person operating shall wear a face shield or safety glasses or goggles, or have safety glass in a windshield and have protective helmets. Just because, the point that I wanted to make, that just because you get a driver's license to be able to operate a vehicle on a public road does not necessarily mean that an accident's not going to occur. Okay, that is a beginning point. And the same thing, say, for PCI compliance. Getting a merchant account doesn't necessarily mean you're going to always be protected.
Another poll question we have is, do you have regular conversations with your government relations and or in-house counsel regarding regulations on compliance?
So we have a poll question for this? Okay, another poll.
And this is something that I would definitely encourage you all to do, is open up a dialogue with your government relations and or your in-house counsel and keep them engaged, because a lot of times they may receive information from associations they're involved with that you may not see when it comes to compliance. So really open up that dialogue and maybe even meet with them 1 or 2 times per year.
Okay. One of the things that, because of the state law that I was just referring to here in Illinois, which is copied for the most part in the other 45 that have state laws, you have a time limit for notifying the different agencies. So it'd be nice to have been trained and discuss this to where you know exactly who you're going to need to contact. It's probably after you involve the legal counsel at the university, right? Okay. While we're thinking about that, I'll go to our next slide here. So the example that I have here then is someone on a motorcycle, and if you look here, they have a helmet, they have safety glasses, and a windshield. This person is compliant with a particular state's DMV regulations for operating a motorcycle on public roads. But again, as I said, just because they are compliant doesn't necessarily mean they're totally protected on a day in and day out basis for against having an accident. I know this person very well, and I don't know that his wife would let him out on the road like this. In fact, here's same guy now. Now he has full helmet protection, leathers, boots, gloves, et cetera, et cetera. The question I have here, though, is he really secure? He's far more secure than he was just with the minimum compliance. But he still must obey all the traffic laws at the same time, et cetera, et cetera. And so, if everyone followed all the laws and everything for driving and everything, we probably would cut out 99% of all the accidents that we have. Similarly, if everyone was following to the letter every day the common sense things for all these other PII regulations that we're talking about, then say with credit cards, probably would not have nearly the number of breaches that are occurred. And I'll give some more examples of those in just a second. Do we have results on the poll?
Mm-hmm. So 32% of you do engage with government relations or legal counsel, but 68% do not. So once again, I'd really encourage you to open up that dialogue.
Okay, all right. Okay, so these are statistics for credit card breaches here over the last 3 years. And I look at this every year for a rolling 3 years backwards, and the numbers don't change very much at all. When you compare higher education with roughly 4,500 colleges and universities against 10 million businesses and the financial institutions, et cetera, we have an abnormally high rate of breaches. And there's several reasons for that. every year, then, as an example of, and everyone could look this up, it's interesting, boring reading, if you will, but the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, DBIR, so Verizon DBIR, every year they produce a very detailed, fine report across all the spectrum of breaches for everything that we've been talking about here. And invariably, every year, the reasons for the breaches are for very easily correctable information, using easily breached passwords as an example. In the PCI world, using the wrong self-assessment questionnaire, which means you've also have not scoped it properly, the right cardholder data environment. So you're looking at it wrong and whatever, you know. No risk assessment has been performed, perhaps, and/or if a risk assessment was performed, it's not followed. So very easily corrected situations there. But the hackers know that higher education is vulnerable, and we win the lottery every year. 33% of all the breaches are from in higher education. The other thing that about 70% of those breaches occur as a result of direct hacking, compared with about 20% in the rest of the business sectors. So that's the situation we face in higher ed. Okay. So when you think about it, higher education is much like a city. And my specialty that I spend so much time in is PCI compliance. So I'm thinking here, there are roughly, if you look at McDonald's and Starbucks and Subways together, there are 50,000 stores in that universe. We have 4,500 colleges and universities. So 50,000 stores, but they have one simple way of taking a credit card: swipe. And it's the safest thing to protect. Whereas at a college campus, we have all these different departments on campus. Think of the bursar for tuition and fees, parking, dining, residence halls, performing arts, athletics, ticketing, and concessions, and the foundations. Every one of these organizations taking cards, I know I seem to be stressing cards, but taking cards, but also all the student information that we have in every conceivable way. So it's very difficult for a college and university to be compliant, to get their arms around this for this reason. But it doesn't mean, because it doesn't give us the excuse for not reaching toward compliance and being secure. So higher education is the most complex environment there is for protecting information. Okay. So whose responsibility on campus is it anyway for compliance for most all these aspects we're talking about? If we talk about for the most part, it is the departments on campus that have the direct responsibility. For PCI, it's the department, the bursar, or the controller's office, will say, that has responsibility because of signing the merchant agreement. It's a business issue, right? Earlier I said that it's under contract law, and so for that reason, then departmental areas have direct responsibility.
John, one of the questions that came across was that if your departments are taking deposits in and they gather all the information up and they bring it to the cashier's office, so they may have credit card checks, a lot of financial information, are you responsible for having your cashiers trained on PCI?
Absolutely. The definition from the PCI Security Standards Council is the one that manages the standard we're talking about, is that anyone who's involved in these three areas, and the definitions are kind of gray, but storing, processing, or transmitting card information then must be trained. All right. And so think about that in the context of the other ACH transactions and everything else. So yes, everyone must be trained. Now, the caveat on that is if you have a student worker and they're at a point of sale machine in the dining hall, and they're only involved in one transaction at a time and they never see it again, well, they don't have to have as much training. Okay, all right. So departments then have the responsibility, the business office, if you will, but most of the work in most cases, particularly for PCI, is in the your information technology and network security department. Roughly, there are 326 controls in the PCI standard, and at least 80% of those are network security issues. Okay, so you absolutely have to work as a team. Absolutely. Another plug for this workshop that I was talking about then. Knowing that at Campus Guard, 80% of the time that we get called by a university is from the business office. 80% of the time. 80% of the work is from the IT office. But usually they come into the situation somewhat reluctantly because they already have so many things to do. They have a certain budget to work with, et cetera, et cetera. So they come into it somewhat reluctantly or whatever. And so the theme of this year's conference is how do we get together and work together as a team to secure this. And what I'm describing here, I know I've talked about PCI, but this applies to every protection that we are responsible for.
So just to speak in here, we've had a few questions regarding, where can you go to find training, how can you get training. I would definitely recommend for all of you to visit familypolicy.ed.gov, and you'll see on the right-hand side that you can sign up for their newsletter and announcements on their training seminars. So that's a very good place. So just do it. It's a quick sign-up. Another place is nakubo.org and acro.org. But Ron's company, campusguard.com, has an extensive training package. So you want to visit their website. So for those of you that were asking about where you can find training, take a look at campusguard.com, and at the end of the session you'll see Ron's contact information, and he'll be more than happy to talk to you about the training. But I would say don't reinvent the wheel. You've got a number of resources that I just told you that where you can find information to help you with your training.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit. We're going to narrow down a little bit and talk about PCI compliance. The PCI standard is in a 3-year window. The latest change was a year ago, January, and that was 3.0. We've now come up with 3.1, 3.2. There are regulation changes, of course, with the other compliance areas we're talking about. There were some significant changes, particularly that affected higher education in 3.0. I want to talk about those. 3.2 will be coming out in the next several weeks. Those are mainly, 3.1, 3.2 mainly are IT-related issues. But there are several things in 3.0. And then we have to think about 4.0, what that's going to be. They're not going to be significant changes. The standard now is reaching a mature state, if you will. So a little tweaking from time to time, keeping up with the current threat landscapes and those kinds of things. But anyway, there was a big change to 3.0. That's my point that I made there. So let's talk about some specific things here. So if you have been following PCI since it was put together in formal fashion in 2006, there are 6 major goals with 12 major requirements supporting those goals. Build and maintain a secure network, protect cardholder data, have a vulnerability management program, implement strong control access, monitor and test those networks and controls, and maintain an information security policy. Those have not changed. They have not changed since 2006. They're not going to change. Didn't change with 3.0. Not going to be changing with 4.0. The merchant levels. So merchant levels, really that classification is to understand then what your compliance, your validation requirement is. That's by merchant level. Level 1 and level 2, there are very few universities and colleges that are even level 2. They have to have 1 million Visa transactions alone or MasterCard transactions alone to be a level 1, level 2. Level 1 is 6 million or more. You don't combine them; they're one or the others. Now, if you're going to be one of these levels for Visa, by natural selection, you're going to be that also for MasterCard, because Visa has 60% of the business, if you will. All right.
So, Ron, for those institutions that use, say, a servicer for their tuition payment plan or a servicer to process their just general tuition payments. Shouldn't the institution be aware of where those organizations fall on this chart to be sure that they're meeting the PCI compliance issues?
Good question, and there's some natural confusion on that because this one is merchant levels. So this is the university itself, the department itself. When you're using a third party, they are a service provider. And where we have 4 levels of merchants, there are 2 levels of service providers. And the cut line between 1 and 2 is 300,000 transactions totally, not just for one customer, but for all of their customers together. You can go to Visa's site, just go Google Visa service provider listing, and that's where they will be found if they are a level 1. Visa does not list level 2s. Level 2s, again, are below 300,000 transactions, and they can self-attest. So the question then to ask then is, why wouldn't you be doing business with a level 1 service provider? Because they have to have a very rigorous test to be compliant. Okay, great question. All right, so most all colleges and universities are level 3 and level 4. Everyone we're talking about today. So the level 3 is talking about e-commerce transactions, and or all the rest then are level 4. So this is where most colleges and universities are. This has not changed since 2006 either. This is the same. All right. So the difference is, going back here, is then is how these attest their compliance. Again, level 1, level 2s have to have a formal report on compliance from a qualified security assessor who has been trained and certified by the PCI Council. You can have a self-assessment questionnaire as your attestation document if you are level 3, level 4. Okay, that's where most everyone lies. All right. The issue then is, are you using the right SAQ? This is the SAQs there. So we have another poll question at this time. Okay.
So one of the questions we wanted to hear from you guys on is, do you have language regarding red flag compliance as part of your agreements with your vendors? So in doing your contracting with your vendors, are you making sure that you have red flag compliance detailed in the agreement? Yes or no, and not sure.
Okay. As we're answering those questions and looking at that, I'll talk about these self-assessment questionnaires, the SAQs. You have from the SAQ-A, which is very simple, 14 questions, and this is if you've totally outsourced your card operations to someone else. And think of it as the first time you know that you have sold something or whatever, when money winds up in your merchant account. All right. The SAQ AEP are one of the major issues then that came out of the S 3.0 in an effort by the council to define the difference between fully outsourced and partially outsourced. And so that caused a lot of issues on campus because we use multiple service providers, multiple third parties is the issue there. So the difference is between 14 and 139 controls. All right. And so on across the award there. By the SAQ-B, either that's the very simple knuckle buster producing a paper receipt. I think there's some of those still around, or the dial-out device is an SAQ-B. And most of those questions are related to physical security and protecting information that way. All the way then to SAQ-D, which has the full gamut of questions and controls, full 326 controls that must be satisfied. Now, you answer the SAQs either yes, it's in place, no, it's not in place, or it's not applicable. But the issue is you really need to know you're using the right SAQ and that the controls are really there or not. Okay. So we have results on the poll.
Yeah, 78% say they're not sure. So that'll be something you're going to want to circle back with your purchasing department or your legal, whoever does your contract, and be sure that the language is included in your contracts with, for instance, your collection agencies, your billing services, your payment processors.
Okay. So,
and Ron, where would they find a sample contract language, or is there some standard red flag language?
Okay, this is a great question. I have an answer for that right now. Okay, all right. So we were talking there about red flags, right? So you have one of the major changes that came in the standard in 3.0 is found in requirement 12, particularly 12.8.5 for merchants. And it says that you must be able to working with your service providers that have an understanding of who has responsibility for what part of the PCI standard when they're handling your credit card information. Again, the definition is storing, processing, or transmitting on your behalf. All right, okay. That was for merchants. Per service providers had a major issue and thrown at them in their testing of compliance with a new 12.9 that says that they must acknowledge in writing their responsibility for protecting your credit card information. They had a year and a half to get ready for this. It became effective in June in 2015, and now it's in full effect. So I knew this was going to be an issue because most of them were going. The legal teams for those service providers were going to have a huge issue with the word responsible. But what I have here is some suggested language, and you as a merchant, then your campus has a responsibility for getting this kind of protection in a contract with your service providers. So I have in red here in the first paragraph. The contractor acknowledges responsibility for the security of card data as defined within the payment card industry data security standard. So that language should be in there. So you should be everyone should be looking at that with their current contracts, and for sure with new ones.
Yeah, and it's also important on your campuses, red flags requires you to have a written policy.
Yes.
So you want to be sure that, I know when I was still at U of I, we had what we called our red flag committee. It was across departments, but you want to be sure that you have that policy written, and maybe you can expand a little bit on how important it is. I guess where all of this gets confusing for all of us on the institution side, it bleeds together. So,
it bleeds together, but it's all, again, talking about confidential and sensitive information. And again, with red flags and HIPAA and Graham-Leach Bly, there are different agencies are involved in that, of course. But it's all, and even in PCI, is confidential, secure and information that we must protect. Okay, so red flags requires policies and programs and training. Further, it has to be certified by the Board of Trustees, and a program is put in place, and you also have your incumbent of having annual training and updating it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. The difference between red flags and PCI is that until there's been a breach, FTC is not going to come knocking on the door. With PCI, then there's a requirement for annual attestation of compliance and being compliant at all times, and the further thing is the quarterly scans. One more item I have here on this, the second paragraph. This is a little harsh language here, but I've seen some universities put this in here that says, also, besides acknowledging responsibility, that you will pay, that the third party will pay for any costs or whatever. So this is going to be available. This webinar is going to be posted, so the language will be available for you to use. Okay, and then at the bottom there, if you have scope of work as attachments to your contracts and everything, then this gives a little hint here on how to actually manage that. How do you know they're going to be that they are compliant? Yeah, then they need to give you a copy of their attestation of compliance.
Yeah, and just so you know, on the Federal Trade Commission's website, there's some great training information that you can read through on what the steps are and requirements for red flags.
Okay, all right.
So go to the Federal Trade Commission website.
We've turned the corner here. We're on the post here, going to the home run, going to the finish line. And by the way, we're going to have plenty of time for questions and answers. All right. Okay. So, practically speaking, here, all of what we're talking about, for the most part, is really as common sense, everyday type issues that we should be aware of. One of the major things that occurred with this 3.0 is that the PCI Council said, look, all of this stuff should be not thought of just as a once a year tick box compliance exercise. It needs to be put into your everyday business as usual practices. Every day. Okay. So some very common things that are across all of these issues we're looking at here is don't email personally identifiable information. For PCI, but here's the issue, and it happens every day. How are you going to prevent me from sending you an email that has my credit card number in it? What do you do with that? Okay, so you need to have a policy that says what to do with that. And basically what it is you send me an email back says, and don't process it. Do not process it from that. It says, unable to process that, send it back using this form, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to have policies and procedures for every one of these things. All right. And if you had a breach, again, I'm going to focus here on a little PCI. If you had a breach, and if you've been using collecting and processing card numbers from the email, and that was the breach point, then the audit's going to come, and they're going to find out. And even if someone in your office was interviewed and asked, well, what's your policy? And they said, well, we never process from that. And then the next question will come, well, show us that written policy. If you don't have a policy, you don't have a policy, is the point here. And that's across all of these things here. Okay. Do permit only personnel with a legitimate need to know access to personally identifiable information. Okay. Destroy information when it's no longer needed. There are heavy penalties. I was focused on Illinois, but it goes across all states, that if data was not properly disposed of, then the fines really are going to increase. Okay, so we have a real strong responsibility for that.
And when you talk about fines, you know, people always make an assumption that, you know, FERPA breaches, there's no financial penalty. But the Department of Ed has leveraged financial penalties over the years when people have had FERPA breaches.
Yeah.
For instance, my favorite one that Leroy Rooker would talk about is where a professor went and looked at his nephew's grades. Well, he shouldn't have done that, and the nephew did file a claim. He wasn't taking his class. It's not anything he should have been looking at. So that it became apparent to me when I read that case study how important it is that everyone at your institution that has access to information, and as all of us are moving towards these very broad ERPs where people have much more access, it's not like you literally have to walk into a file room in admissions and records or the registrar to see grades anymore. Things are very accessible. So really making sure that they understand who can have access. And one of the questions that came up, you know, there's that differentiation from when a student turns 18. So the time before they're 18, it's the parents can have access. And once we drop the gauntlet at 18 and they're now attending your institution, a lot of times we find it very difficult to deal with parents who want access to their student records, and they're angry that they can't see everything. So maybe as you're talking about this, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of, or Merle, maybe you want to pick this one up, the importance of providing, you know, what is PII? What is your directory information, and having your staff understand, you know, who they can release information to, how, you know. So Merle, do you want to pick up a little bit on FERPA?
Sure. We all know that you have to have from a student as to who you can talk to. If they're going to have you talk with their parent, they have to be listed in your system, and a record of that information has to be provided. If you do not have, you cannot share that information or any information about that student with a person who walks into your office or who calls and says, I'm the mother of so-and-so, and I need to pay this bill, and I need to do this or that, and are very upset when they, in fact, are not listed as a person by the student who should have access to their information. When they pay the bill, they get very upset when they do that. So you need written processes and procedures in place in your office about how you handle any inquiry that comes in about a student. Who can you share information with, who can not, where do you go to find that information, and how do you verify all of that? So that, to me, is one of the most important parts of FERPA. And I know that everyone who's on this call is very familiar with FERPA and how you cannot breach that confidence that you have with that student without their permission. So, Ryan, you want to pick up, or Judy, you want to add?
I was just going to say, and you have to be very careful that the student may give a parent access to their financial information, but they have to also then say if they want the person to have access to their academic information. And those are two separate permissions. You have to be very careful with that when giving people access to information. So, sorry,
Excellent point, Judy.
And then at one of the bullets at the bottom here, as I said earlier, do document your department desktop procedures. Keep them up to date. Procedures follow policy, and you need to keep them up to date. Be able, probably handy to have a handy pull list here for particularly new employees to be able to answer that very vague question about academic records versus health records versus what can I do, those kinds of things. Very important there. Okay, so back, one more thing about training. We can't overemphasize the point about training. We all have responsibility for training initial hires and then also for annual training. Most everyone probably has some form of formal training established at the campus. One thing I would say, it's easier to do this and more cost effective if you have online training, particularly if the content is fresh. But one thing about the training then is one, the initial enrollment of everyone who's responsible, whatever, and keeping records of them when they've had the training, and then reminders of refresh training. And then particularly the other thing that we don't think about sometimes is a couple of years may go by and there may be a case brought to court finally, may work its way through court, and that's the last thing we want, is to have get something like this into court. But it happens, all we have to do is look at the Chronicle every week and see what's going on. But then if it ever does get into court, then you're going to be, you would be need to be ready to produce records of who had training when, because we have adjunct professors. We have people move around from campus to campus or whatever. So you may very well have a situation of an event or whatever, something that happened 3 years in the past. You need to have records of who had training when and be able to prove and document that. So having an online system is very, very important in retrieving that information. Okay. All right, so we've gone right at an hour. We have time for questions, is that right? Okay. I want to talk about some resources that we have here for everyone. The first one then is the PCI Security Standards.org, and this is again the council that manages the PCI standard, certifies the companies and the individuals that can audit, if you will. There's a tremendous amount of information there on all of the subjects of PCI there. Also, I mentioned the Treasury Institute and that workshop. It comes up on May 22nd. There will be roughly 200 colleges and universities there, and I would suggest, if you're interested at all, take this one down right now and go to the Treasury Institute's site and register, because there are a limited number of spaces. And I think as of yesterday, there are probably only 75 slots left for that, and that's going to be beautiful Savannah. But we have also then resources then for FERPA, red flags, GLB, and HIPAA here also. Okay.
Okay. A question we have here, and I don't, is there a website with sample permission forms? It was asked by someone, if you're talking about forms for release of information where a student can create an authorized payer or access to their records, both NACUBO and ACRO on their websites have the information? So you can visit there for those forms. And then Ron, I've got a, let's go back to this one. A nice long question for you. For payments and collection agency invoice information that are sent to the school to be processed and uploaded into the school system, should the school keep a hard copy of these payments? If so, for how long? What about, so...
Okay, good question. I think we're probably talking about credit card information.
Well, no,
for one
this
thing.
is where the agency is basically just telling us who paid
Okay.
them on behalf of the school. So the collection agency would be keeping copies of all of that financial information. When they transmit to the school, it's simply a report of who paid. And if I'm interpreting the question right, they're asking, should they keep copies of those financial transactions? But wouldn't that be the responsibility of the collection agency or the billing service?
I believe so. But the other thing is that you need to have a policy of what you're doing, and then it must be the data that must be protected at all times. Okay. Take an example of credit card information, if you will. Everyone probably is familiar with Go Army. That has created some wrinkles with PCI compliance, because all they're worried about really, Go Army is worried about fraud and we're not particularly about PCI compliance. So they send via email. They send credit card information via email. And I told you what to do with that. But everything else then, say credit card information, if I kind of go off on a slice on that for a moment. After you have processed, I have the card information authorized, the card payment authorized, there's no reason to keep the full 16-character number. If you do keep the full 16-character number, then everything must be protected. Name, expiration date, et cetera, et cetera. So the only thing we need for credit cards is really either maybe the first four or the last four of the credit card number, because there's a difference between credit card information versus payment information. The bank has all of that information.
Right.
Put it back on them. But
Yeah.
the issue is you must have a formal way of protecting all of this information.
I want to go back to the information, the statement that you received from your collection agency. That is a business record and should be maintained pursuant to the business policy for the retention of records at your school. Yes, the agency will maintain a copy of that as part of their standard business records retention policy, but you also have a policy and you should abide by that policy.
Well, let's just, maybe the three of us can have a little conversation here about that. When agencies or billing services are collecting these financial transactions, they don't send any of the specifics to those transactions over in the files. They simply tell us who paid and how much and the date. So
Right.
all of the PCI and compliance issues would then reside with the servicer, and it
Right.
keeps the institution out of having to maintain very specific information. All the institution needs to maintain in their ERP or their student loan billing system is where the transaction came from, the amount, and the date.
That's why I make the
agree with
point
that,
that it is a
Yeah, I agree. I agree. You just, whatever the minimum information you need to keep a record of having that transaction. Again, we don't need all of it.
Another question on here, and Merle, I'm going to ask you about this one. Bankruptcy documentation. So when the institution receives requests from either legal counsel or the collection agency and the bankruptcy documentation, and they get it at the school, what should the retention requirements be?
Here again, it is a part of your business records, and you abide by your retention policy at the school. If you're working with a collection agency and you receive it at the school, you obviously need to advise the agency that you have received bankruptcy information and provide them with that information so they can cease and desist pursuant to the bankruptcy law. But for the retention of that information, you should do it from a business record.
And I know when I was at Illinois, there was a definite hierarchy on what you had to keep, how long you had to keep it. So I agree with Merle that, this is a good point where you can go back to your in-house counsel, or a lot of schools have people that just are responsible for records management. I know at University of Illinois we had a specific office that was responsible for records management. So circle back with them and find out what they're telling you the policy is.
Absolutely. When we talked earlier about your relationship with your government office as well as your legal counsel, and I will be a little bit more inclined for you to be on the same basis with those people. Coming out of the legal world, you need to have that relationship so that you can always go and ask a question that you are not 100% comfortable with in your legal counsel's office or in your government office. So, those are resources for you that are provided by the school for you to use. So meet them, get on a first-name basis, learn who their staff is, who's knowledgeable in each of the areas, and use that resource to its maximum. It will help in a situation or any other situation that you find yourself.
And just circling back, you do want to be sure that your institution has a records retention policy and schedule. If you're at an institution that doesn't have that, I would encourage you to work with, once again, across campus offices and your in-house counsel to establish the records retention policy. We have a question here to repeat the websites that we've been talking about. One is nacubo.org, nacubo.org. The other one is AACRAO, AACRAO.org. Then campusguard.com. So those were the websites that we talked about, and I also managed, if you Google red flags, they'll take you right to the FTC's website where they have some guidance and training materials. But once again, the Campus Guard product gives you all of the training in one part. Here's a question for you, Ron. Is the student's account number considered PII?
If that can be used in combination with anything else to identify the identity of a student, okay? So that specifically is referenced in the Illinois state law.
So if they can use the student's number and their date of birth, and that will
Right.
identify the student, it becomes PII.
Yes.
Okay. This is one I don't remember the answer to, so I'm going to have to draw on you guys. Do FERPA regulations still apply after a student has graduated or otherwise left the university? Merle?
I believe it does, Judy. That information was provided to you by the student when they were on your campus. It's part of your records retention that you have the information, and you still should guard that information.
Yeah.
I think that's one of those common sense things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ron, this is actually one of our last questions sitting out here. One institution is asking, we've had challenges engaging current vendors in completion of the PCI responsibility matrix. Any tips or hints for this? And is there some sample contract language?
Okay. Well, I have one. I would refer back just to that simple language that I had there as a beginning point or whatever. But if you look at requirement, both of those statements came out of, well, that page came out of in response to requirement 12, which deals with managing third parties. So one, you have responsibility yourself to be dealing with third parties who are certified as PCI compliant. Okay. So the hammer that you have then is not to do business with them, for one thing. All right. Particularly, as I said, I knew all the vendors were going to struggle with that requirement 12 that required them to have it in writing their responsibility. They had a year, they've now had almost 2 years to be there in whatever, So one, be reviewing your contracts as they're coming up. find that language or whatever, and then insist that they show you their progress toward certification if they're not, and then also then insist on receiving the gold standard would be the attestation of compliance from their report from their own audit. Again, and I would, if you're using third parties and they're defined as a service provider, strongly urge you only to use those that are certified as level 1, because that means that a third party looked at them.
Okay.
All right.
Merle, do you have any closing remarks?
I have one very quick question for Ron as it relates to training. The training materials and the records you keep, Ron, how long should you keep them for?
Well, I gave an example of 3 years. I don't think there's a sunset law on there's legal. There are sunset laws on criminal law, if you will, but civil there's no sunset law, right?
Right.
So it needs to be encrypted. It needs to be, kept digitally and whatever be retrievable. I have one closing comment myself on all these things we've been talking about, the need for having an overall campus plan for security and whatever. Remember, this is going to sound a little trite, but it's true. Remember that hope that something is not going to happen is not a very good plan. So let's all get our plans in place.
So I would definitely encourage all of you to circle back, especially with your chief financial officer, and find out what policies are in place, where your coverage is. I would encourage you to implement annual training on all of these, because truthfully you never really know when somebody may pick up something with financial information. It's really a lot of gray areas that we deal with in our organizations. And like I said, especially since we have ERPs now where there's so much information flowing across all of our departments. Ron, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to participate today. And Merle, also thank you. It's been a great conversation. Did you have any other questions that you think of? You can send them to webinars@ers.com, and we'll work over the next few days and we will get you answers. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to Tom.
This is Tom again, and I just want to thank everyone for attending today, for Ron and Judy and Merle for the presentation. I think it was very informative. I know that we got a lot of information out there, and for that reason we're going to archive the webinar on our website, which you can see on the screen right now. There will also be a survey after the webinar is complete. Please spend an extra couple of minutes and do that for us. It will be very helpful for us as we plan future webinars. And we appreciate everyone's time. We know you're all very busy. Have a wonderful day, and thank you again.
Thank you.